So, Acts chapter 10. This is going to be a series, I just know it. I can feel it. I commonly hear Acts chapter 10 being used as a proof text in order to prove that the kosher laws have been done away with. I'm here to tell you that Acts chapter 10 does not say that. In fact, I think there are better arguments out there for the doing away with the kosher laws, but Acts chapter 10 is by far the weakest one. Full disclosure, I don't think any of the kosher laws are done away with. But that being said, let's get into it. So Peter's on the rooftop praying one of the 3 daily prayers like any normal Jew would. He sees a sheet coming down from the heavens being lowered by its 4 corners. That's important. And then a voice from heaven says, "Peter, eat." What does Peter do? No. No? This man just looked at God and said no. "For I have never eaten anything unholy or unclean." You've just made a very important distinction, unholy and unclean. You see, unholy actually applies to foods that would otherwise be clean, but are not good enough for a temple sacrifice. So it's still a clean animal. And then unclean being that he has never eaten anything unclean. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Unclean being that he has never eaten anything unclean. That one's pretty self-explanatory. It says it happens 3 times and it's taken away. Notice he never ate anything. Before the sheet is taken up, he says, "What God has made clean, you must not call unholy." Difference in words. And Peter is confused. He doesn't know what the vision means. Notice he didn't say, "What God has made clean, you must not call unclean." That's different entirely. You must not call unholy. And in case you're wondering, it is 2 different Greek words. Fast forward. Peter goes to meet with Cornelius, and he says to Cornelius, "You yourselves know that it is not permitted for a Jewish man to associate with a non-Jew or to visit him. Yet God has shown me that I must call no man unholy or unclean." According to Peter's own interpretation of the vision, it's about people, not about food. The food is just an object lesson. The lesson is more or less, people were never mentioned in the Bible in any way, shape, or form, whether they be a Gentile or a stranger. They're never called unholy or unclean, ever. But clean, ever. But food is. So there's a distinction that needs to be drawn. Food and these things are unclean. But what I have made clean, you can't call that unclean. People were never made unclean, so you can't just say that they're unclean now because you don't like Gentiles. And yes, Judaism back then basically was racist against Gentiles. And here's where the historical relevance comes into play. Judaism considered Gentiles to be unholy. That even if a Gentile so much as touched your food in any way, shape, or form at any point, it was no longer considered clean food. You know, because Gentiles are sinners and idolaters. This was the common thought process for a Jew back then. You just didn't associate with Gentiles because they're idolaters, they're unclean, they're unholy people. And you're supposed to be the holy chosen people of God, so why would you go anywhere near them? Peter's vision of the sheet was meant to teach him that Gentiles are not unclean by virtue of the fact that they're Gentiles. At no point in time did the vision mean to Peter anything about food. And we know this because Peter actually gives his interpretation of the vision twice. So if at any point Peter believed in his lifetime that that vision meant that the food laws are now done away with, he would have said something. He had more than enough opportunity to do so, and he never took the chance. So we have one of 2 options. Either he never talked about it, or he never believed that the vision meant anything about food. And this is common within Jewish teaching too, parables. Let's talk about parables just a minute. Because here's the thing with parables. Within Judaism, parables are a common method of teaching, especially in ancient Judaism. But parables are meant to draw one conclusion and one conclusion only. Just one. Once you've driven home that one conclusion, the rest of the parable is not meant to be identified in any other way, shape, or form to include any kind of other doctrine. It is just a way to drive a single point home. Parables were never meant to be this thing where you would break every layer of it down and give a different lesson on each part of the parable and his layers and bring a doctrine out of it. You're not supposed to do that at all. Once you've made your singular point on your parable, you ignore the rest of it. Once you've made your singular point on your parable, you ignore the rest of it. It's just 1 point. 1 point. Now, can a parable accidentally contain other truths within it? Like more than one truth? Sure, but they were never used that way. They were meant to just drive home 1 point. So in summary, what's the 1 point here? The 1 point is this: Gentiles aren't unclean. Nowhere in the Torah does it say that Gentiles are unclean. That's something you guys made up. And Peter needed to hear that. He lived a Jew his whole life, so he had this presupposition in his head that Gentiles are just unclean. He basically treated that like it was scripture because he believed it was scripture. It's what he was taught. Peter didn't have access to a Torah scroll. He had to be taught a Torah scroll from a rabbi. So he couldn't go back and fact check it and pull up an encyclopedia or check his phone and look for verses that says Gentiles are unclean. He couldn't do any of that. He relied on the teachings of his rabbi. Culturally, 1st century Jews just accepted this teaching, but then Peter realizes that our master Yeshua never taught that. Sorry this lesson was a little long, but it was a lot to cover, so sorry not sorry.